Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. On a cold November evening in 1903, as frost settled across the valleys and crevices of the Ozark Mountains, a peculiar discovery was made on the property of Jeremiah Caldwell, a reclusive farmer whose land sat nestled between two limestone ridges along the Buffalo River in northern Arkansas. What began as a simple accident, a wagon wheel stuck in what appeared to be soft earth, would become the beginning of one of the most unsettling geological mysteries ever documented in the region. A case that even now raises questions about what truly lies beneath the peaceful farms and rolling hills of the Ozarks. The accounts I'm about to share have been pieced together from county records, newspaper articles preserved in the Searcy County Historical Society archives, statements from the few remaining relatives of those involved, and several personal journals that remained sealed until 1968, when they were discovered during renovations to the county courthouse basement. These documents provide us with a timeline of events spanning several decades, though our focus will remain on the peculiar occurrences beginning in the autumn of 1903. Jeremiah Caldwell was not originally from the Ozarks. Records indicate he purchased the 160-acre property in 1897, paying a surprisingly large sum to the previous owner, a man named Silas Merritt, who had worked the land for nearly 30 years. What's particularly interesting about this transaction is that Merritt sold the property rather abruptly, relocating his entire family to Oregon within weeks of the sale. When interviewed by the local newspaper about his sudden departure, Merritt offered only vague mentions of health concerns and a change in circumstances. This abrupt exit would later take on a more ominous significance. The Merritt family had been respected members of the community, active in the local church and regular participants in county fairs and social gatherings. Their sudden departure generated considerable speculation among their neighbors. According to an account from Lucinda Hawkins, whose family owned the adjacent property to the east, Silas Merritt had changed noticeably in the months before the sale. He stopped coming to town meetings, Hawkins recalled in a statement recorded in 1945 by a local historian. When I'd see him at the general store, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His wife told my mother that he'd taken to spending nights in the barn rather than in the house, claiming he needed to keep watch, though over what, she didn't know. Most telling was a comment reportedly made by Merritt to Ezekiel Thompson, the blacksmith in Marshall, just days before the sale was finalized. Thompson, in a letter to his brother dated October 1897, wrote, "Silas came by to settle his account yesterday, said he was heading west and wouldn't be back. When I asked why the rush, he just looked at me strange-like and said, 'There's something wrong with that land, Zeke.' I kept it contained as best I could, but it's getting worse. Let Caldwell deal with it now." Wouldn't say more, no matter how I pressed him. Caldwell himself was something of an enigma to his neighbors. At approximately 50 years of age upon his arrival, he was older than most who sought to establish new farms in the region. His accent suggested origins from somewhere in the Northeast, possibly Pennsylvania, though he rarely discussed his past. Unlike many farmers in the area who relied on family labor, Caldwell hired workers from neighboring communities, paying them well but rarely allowing them to work past sunset. According to tax records and business ledgers from the general store in Marshall, Caldwell appeared to have considerable financial resources for someone who claimed to be a simple farmer. He ordered specialized equipment from as far away as Chicago and St. Louis and made frequent trips to Springfield, Missouri, always returning with crates of supplies that were delivered directly to the farm without passing through local merchants. The farm itself was situated in a peculiar location. While most Ozark farmers sought out the fertile bottomlands along rivers, Caldwell's property extended across a rugged limestone ridge with only about 40 acres suitable for cultivation. The remainder consisted of rocky slopes and a series of unusual depressions that locals had long referred to as sinkholes, common features in the karst landscape of the Ozarks. The property's centerpiece was a sprawling farmhouse built by Merritt in the 1870s, positioned atop a gentle rise that offered views across the valley. What made the property particularly unusual was not just its topography, but certain peculiarities in its history. Local records indicated that before Merritt acquired the land in the 1860s, 2 previous attempts at settlement had been abandoned. The first, by a family named Carver in the 1840s, ended when they simply disappeared, leaving behind a partially constructed cabin and most of their possessions. The second, by a man named Luther Braddock in the 1850s, ended more dramatically, with Braddock allegedly burning his own homestead to the ground before fleeing the area, claiming to have heard voices from below, according to accounts in a missionary's journal from 1858. For his first 6 years on the property, Caldwell maintained a modest but profitable operation, growing primarily corn and raising a small herd of cattle. He was known to be fair in his business dealings at the general store in Marshall, the nearest town of any size, but he never participated in community gatherings or church services. His only regular visitor was Dr. Montgomery Webb, a physician from Springfield, Missouri, who would arrive every few months, staying at the farm for several days before departing again. Local speculation suggested the doctor was treating Caldwell for some chronic condition, though the nature of his ailment remained unknown. Amos Wilbright, who delivered mail to the more remote farms in the county, noted in his personal diary that Webb often arrived with crates of equipment that appeared more suited to scientific research than medical treatment. Dr. Webb came through again today, Wilbright wrote in an entry dated April 1901, had him 3 large wooden crates marked delicate instruments from some university back east. Asked me casual-like if I'd noticed any tremors in the ground lately, or if folks had been reporting any strange sounds at night. Told him no, though Carson's boy did mention their well water turned cloudy last week for no reason they could figure. The events that concern our story began in earnest on November 12, 1903. According to statements given by Harlan Blackwood, a hired hand who had worked for Caldwell for nearly 3 years, the day had begun like any other late autumn day on the farm. The morning had been spent preparing the property for winter, storing equipment, securing outbuildings, and bringing in the last of the harvest. Blackwood's account, recorded in a statement to the county sheriff 3 weeks later, described how at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon he had been driving a wagon loaded with corn from the western field back to the barn when one of the wheels suddenly sank into what appeared to be a soft patch of ground. This was unusual, as there had been no significant rainfall for weeks, and the ground should have been firm. Upon inspecting the wheel, Blackwood discovered that the earth beneath it had simply given way, revealing what appeared to be a small opening into a dark void below. Using the handle of his shovel, he probed the hole and found no resistance, an indication that whatever space existed beneath was more substantial than a simple animal burrow or erosion cavity. In his official statement, Blackwood described the opening as perfectly round, about the size of a dinner plate, and the edges were smooth like they'd been cut rather than just collapsed. This detail, seemingly minor at the time, would later take on greater significance in light of subsequent discoveries. Blackwood immediately informed Caldwell, who approached the site with what witnesses would later describe as unusual agitation. Rather than expressing mere curiosity or concern about the damaged wagon, Caldwell seemed genuinely disturbed by the discovery. According to Blackwood's statement, Caldwell ordered him to cover the hole with several large stones and specifically instructed him to tell no one about what they had found. Here, the narrative diverges somewhat. In Blackwood's initial statement to the sheriff, he claimed that Caldwell simply wanted the hole filled to prevent livestock from injuring themselves. However, in a personal journal discovered decades later among Blackwood's possessions after his death in 1952, he wrote a different account of Caldwell's reaction. "The old man went pale as a sheet when he saw that opening in the ground," Blackwood wrote. "He stood there staring down into it for the longest time, not saying a word. Then he started muttering something about keeping it sealed, and nothing can get out. When I asked him what he meant, he just looked at me like he'd forgotten I was there, then told me to cover it up and never speak of it again. Said he'd pay me an extra month's wages just to forget I ever saw it." The journal entry continues with an observation that takes on particular significance in light of later events. "There was something strange about that hole. When I stuck the shovel handle down into it, I felt, not resistance exactly, but something else, like something moved away from the handle, and there was a smell coming up from it, not like the usual damp earth smell you get from a sinkhole, but something sharper, almost metallic. Made my nose burn a bit, and for just a second I thought I heard something moving down there, a sort of dry sliding sound. Told myself it was just loose soil falling, but I don't rightly believe that's what it was." Whether motivated by genuine safety concerns or something more troubling, Caldwell's insistence on concealing the discovery might have ended the matter there, had it not been for two factors: the arrival of an early winter storm that night and the unexpected visit of Dr. Webb the following morning. The storm that swept across the Ozarks on the night of November 12th was unusually severe for that time of year. Temperatures plummeted and heavy rain turned to sleet and then to snow. Local weather records from Marshall indicate that nearly 6 inches of snow fell overnight, an extraordinary amount for northern Arkansas in November. The sudden cold snap froze the wet ground solid and created dangerous conditions on the primitive roads that connected the remote farms to nearby towns. It was into this wintry scene that Dr. Webb arrived, his horse and buggy nearly frozen from the difficult journey from Springfield. According to Blackwood's journal, Webb's visit had not been expected, and Caldwell seemed both surprised and disturbed by the doctor's presence. The two men immediately sequestered themselves in Caldwell's study, where they remained in heated discussion for several hours. Though Blackwood could not hear the specifics of their conversation, he noted that both men's voices were raised at times, with Webb apparently insisting on something that Caldwell was reluctant to agree to. Later examination of Webb's personal correspondence, preserved in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society, suggests that his unexpected visit was prompted by unusual readings from what he referred to as monitoring devices he had apparently installed at various locations on the Caldwell property. In a letter to a colleague at Johns Hopkins University dated November 10, 1903, just 2 days before the discovery of the hole, Webb wrote, "The seismographic readings from Site C show increasing instability at the 200-foot depth. The patterns are consistent with those observed in '87 before the Mansfield event. I fear another geological anomaly may be imminent. Telegraphed C to advise but have received no response. Will depart for the site tomorrow if weather permits." By mid-afternoon, the storm had intensified, making travel impossible. Dr. Webb was forced to stay the night, an arrangement that seemed to further agitate Caldwell. During dinner, which Blackwood was invited to join due to the unusual circumstances, the tension between the two men was palpable. Webb repeatedly made veiled references to the matter we discussed and necessary precautions, while Caldwell responded with curt dismissals and attempts to change the subject. After the meal, Caldwell retired to his room, leaving Webb and Blackwood alone in the dining room. It was then, according to Blackwood's journal, that Webb began to question him about recent occurrences on the farm. "The doctor asked me if I'd noticed anything unusual lately," Blackwood wrote. "Any strange sounds at night, any disturbances in the livestock, any unexpected changes in the land itself. I didn't mention the hole right away. Mr. Caldwell had been clear about keeping it quiet, but there was something in the doctor's manner that made me think he already knew about it. He had this intensity in his eyes, like a man tracking something dangerous. Blackwood, uncertain of his loyalties in this situation, initially spoke only of minor oddities, the unusual behavior of the farm dogs, who had taken to howling at night for no apparent reason, and the strange discoloration he had noticed in the water drawn from the property's main well over the past week. Webb listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small, leather-bound book he carried. "There's one more thing," Blackwood finally admitted, according to his journal. "Something happened today, out in the western field. Found a hole in the ground, but not like any sinkhole I've seen before. Mr. Caldwell had me cover it up right away, seemed mighty upset about it." Upon hearing this, Webb's demeanor changed dramatically. He insisted on seeing the location immediately, despite the storm and the growing darkness. Blackwood reluctantly agreed to show him, concerned about betraying Caldwell's trust, but equally troubled by Webb's obvious distress. The two men donned heavy coats and took lanterns from the mudroom. The snow was falling heavily now, but Webb was insistent. They trudged across the farmyard and into the western field, where Blackwood had placed stones over the mysterious opening. The stones were now covered with several inches of snow, but Webb seemed to know exactly where to look. What they found beneath those stones would dramatically alter their understanding of the Caldwell property. The small opening that Blackwood had discovered had widened considerably, now measuring nearly 3 feet across. More disturbing was the fact that the edges of the hole showed signs of having been disturbed from below, with odd marks scoring the soil in small piles of earth that had clearly been pushed upward, rather than falling in. Webb knelt beside the opening, holding his lantern over it to illuminate what lay beneath. The light revealed not a simple sinkhole or animal burrow, but what appeared to be a carefully constructed stone passageway, its walls lined with fitted limestone blocks that had partially collapsed, creating the opening they now observed. "My God!" Webb whispered, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "It's happening again." Before Blackwood could ask what he meant, they heard a sound that froze them both in place, a low, undulating moan that seemed to rise from the depths below, followed by a series of sharp clicking noises that echoed up through the opening. Webb immediately pulled back from the hole, his face drained of color. Without explanation, he grabbed Blackwood's arm and began pulling him back toward the farmhouse. "We need to wake Jeremiah," he said urgently. "It's worse than I feared." As they hurried back through the snowstorm, Blackwood noticed something that he only mentioned briefly in his journal, but which takes on greater significance in light of later events. The snow falling around the opening in the ground appeared to be melting as it approached, suggesting that heat was rising from below, heat sufficient to keep the area immediately around the hole free of accumulation despite the freezing temperatures. The events of that night, as recorded in Blackwood's journal and later corroborated by documents found among Dr. Webb's possessions, marked the beginning of what would come to be known locally as the Caldwell phenomenon, a series of increasingly disturbing geological anomalies that would eventually lead to the abandonment of the property. Upon returning to the farmhouse, Webb immediately confronted Caldwell, who had already retired for the night. Their conversation, which Blackwood could hear parts of from his room down the hall, revealed that both men knew far more about the strange opening than they had initially let on. "You told me it was secure," Webb said, his voice tight with controlled concern. "You assured me the last time I was here that you had checked all the known fissures and found them intact." "I did," Caldwell responded, his voice weaker than Blackwood had ever heard it. "This must be a new breach. The mapping didn't show anything in that section of the property." "New or old, it doesn't matter now," Webb said. "The anomaly is active again. Didn't you hear what I said? There were fresh markings and the sounds—" "I know what it sounds like," Caldwell interrupted sharply. "I've been hearing them for weeks now, just at the edge of perception. I convinced myself it was my imagination, that after all these years of vigilance, I was becoming paranoid. Their voices lowered then, and Blackwood could make out only fragments. Original research, my grandfather's mistake, and most frequently, the necessary protocols. Whatever these protocols were, they appeared to involve substantial preparations, as the next sound Blackwood heard was that of heavy trunks being dragged across the floor of Caldwell's bedroom. Later that night, unable to sleep and increasingly disturbed by what he had witnessed, Blackwood crept from his room and made his way to Caldwell's study. The door was unlocked, and inside, illuminated by a single oil lamp, he found a large oak table covered with maps and documents that had apparently been recently examined. Most were rolled up or stacked in folders, but one large map remained spread open, weighted down at the corners with small metal objects. In his journal, Blackwood described what he saw. It was a map of the property, but like no survey map I've ever seen. Beneath the usual markings for fields and buildings were layers of other lines, drawn in different colors, showing what looked like tunnels or passages running deep under the land. They spread out like the roots of some massive tree, going down and down through layers marked with numbers, 100, 200, all the way to what looked like 600 or more. And there were symbols at certain junctions, circles with crosses through them, triangles with strange markings inside, and at the deepest levels, shapes I didn't recognize at all. In the corner of the map was a name and date, J. Caldwell, 1853. Not Jeremiah, but someone before him, I'd guess. Blackwood didn't dare linger long enough to examine the other documents in detail, but he noted that several appeared to be journal entries or field notes, filled with diagrams of unusual geological formations and what looked like mineral deposits unlike any he recognized. The storm continued through the night, with howling winds that made it impossible for Blackwood to hear any further conversations between the two men. He slept fitfully, troubled by what he had witnessed and by dreams filled with strange, clicking sounds and the sensation of something moving beneath his bed. The following morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed during the night. Blackwood rose early, as was his habit, and found both Caldwell and Webb already in the kitchen, surrounded by an array of unusual equipment spread across the large oak table. There were surveying tools, several leather-bound books with elaborate diagrams, and, most strangely, what appeared to be specialized mining equipment, including safety lamps of a design Blackwood had never seen before. Neither man acknowledged him immediately, both absorbed in their examination of a large yellowed map that Caldwell had unrolled across one end of the table. When they finally noticed his presence, Caldwell quickly rolled up the map and gave him an assessment that would change the course of Blackwood's life. "Harlan," Caldwell said, using the farmhand's first name for perhaps the first time, "what you've witnessed, what you've helped Dr. Webb discover, places you in a position of significant responsibility. I need to know that you can be trusted with matters of the utmost sensitivity and potential scientific importance." Blackwood, a pragmatic man who had spent most of his life engaged in the straightforward work of farming, found himself uncharacteristically hesitant. There was something in Caldwell's manner, a combination of fear and resignation, that struck him as deeply troubling. Nevertheless, his sense of loyalty prevailed, and he assured his employer that he could be relied upon. What Caldwell revealed next was so at odds with Blackwood's understanding of the world that he would later admit in his journal that his first instinct had been to dismiss it all as the ravings of a disturbed mind. However, the presence of Dr. Webb, a respected physician known for his rational approach and scientific mindset, lent credibility to the fantastic narrative that unfolded. According to Caldwell, the property had been in his family's possession since the 1840s, when his grandfather, Josiah Caldwell, had first purchased it from the federal government. Josiah had not been a farmer, but a geologist with a particular interest in cave systems. His initial surveys of the property had revealed an extensive network of limestone caves beneath the surface, far more complex than the typical karst formations found throughout the Ozarks. "My grandfather was a man of science, but also of pride," Caldwell explained. "What he discovered beneath this land was so unusual, so contrary to established understanding, that he became obsessed with documenting it completely before sharing his findings with the scientific community. He wanted the glory of the discovery to be his alone." This obsession had led Josiah to construct a series of reinforced entrances into the cave system, allowing him to descend safely and conduct his research. For nearly a decade he had worked in secret, making only occasional trips to St. Louis to consult with certain colleagues who shared his specialized interests. In 1853, something changed. Josiah's journals, which had been meticulously detailed, suddenly became erratic and filled with obscure references to the phenomenon and evidence of unusual formations. He began hiring workers to expand the entrances and to construct what he referred to as monitoring structures deep within the cave system. Then, in the winter of 1856, disaster struck. A severe earthquake, likely the same tremor that famously caused the Mississippi River to flow backward near New Madrid, damaged portions of Josiah's underground constructions. In the aftermath, according to fragmented accounts in his final journal, the phenomenon accelerated. What exactly this phenomenon was remained maddeningly unclear in Caldwell's explanation. He spoke in vague terms of geological processes that had existed in isolated pockets deep within the cave system, separated from the surface world for countless millennia. Josiah's intrusions had disturbed them, and the earthquake had broken the natural barriers that had kept them contained. "It's not merely a geological anomaly as we understand them," Caldwell said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper despite the fact that they were alone in the farmhouse. "The formations bear some resemblance to certain crystalline structures, but their growth patterns and responses to stimuli are entirely different. They possess a form of, I hesitate to use the word behavior, but there's no other term that adequately describes the way they respond to changes in their environment." The consequences of the acceleration in 1856 had been swift and puzzling. Within weeks, the local water table had shifted dramatically. Wells had gone dry or turned acidic, and unusual mineral deposits had begun appearing in streams throughout the region. Josiah himself survived only long enough to implement what he called the containment protocol, a complex process that involved collapsing key tunnels and installing specialized monitoring equipment on the remaining entrances. In his final journal entry, dated March 3, 1856, Josiah wrote words that Jeremiah Caldwell now quoted from memory. "What we discovered is not merely a new geological formation, but a parallel process of mineral evolution, one that has proceeded in isolation for perhaps millions of years. These formations have developed characteristics we cannot yet comprehend, adaptations to the eternal darkness that make them uniquely suited to their environment, but profoundly disruptive to surface geology. They must remain below, contained within the deepest chambers. If they were to establish themselves in the upper world, the consequences for local ecosystems would be beyond calculation." The property had passed to Jeremiah's father, who had maintained the monitoring protocols without fully understanding their purpose, and then to Jeremiah himself. For decades, the containment had held, with only occasional minor breaches that were quickly addressed. Dr. Webb, whose grandfather had been one of Josiah's few confidants, had inherited both the knowledge of the cave system and the responsibility of helping to maintain its monitoring equipment. "And now," Caldwell concluded, "we have a major breach, at a time when I am too old and too ill to address it as it must be addressed. This responsibility falls to you, Harlan, and to anyone else we can trust to help us reseal what should never have been disturbed in the first place." Blackwood's initial skepticism was profound. The story seemed like something from a dime novel, too fantastic to be taken seriously. Yet the fear in both men's eyes was real, as was the elaborate documentation they showed him: maps of the cave system, journals dating back decades, and photographs of strange formations and shadowy structures that defied easy explanation. More convincing still was what they showed him next: a sealed glass container holding what appeared to be a preserved mineral specimen. It resembled a large crystal or geode, but its structure was wrong, its formations arranged in a way that corresponded to no known mineralogical pattern. Most disturbing of all was what appeared to be evidence of growth patterns that suggested something far more organic than mere crystal formation. "This," Webb said quietly, "is just a small fragment. The formations deeper in the system are considerably more complex." Blackwood stared at the preserved specimen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Its structure was approximately the size of his hand, with a segmented, lattice-like framework that gleamed with an unusual iridescence even in the dim light. The multiple protrusions, he counted at least 12, seemed to be specialized for different functions. Some resembled typical crystal formations, others flat fan-like structures, and still others terminated in what looked disturbingly like small articulated appendages. "How does something like this even form?" Blackwood asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "And if these things have been down there all this time, why haven't miners or cave explorers found them before?" Webb exchanged a glance with Caldwell before responding. "They have," he said simply. "The unusual mineral deposits that occur periodically throughout the Ozarks, veins of ore that seem to appear suddenly in mines that had been thoroughly explored, strange crystalline formations that grow at rates far exceeding normal geological processes. Many of these can be attributed to contact with what dwells below. But such incidents are isolated, the evidence usually degrading rapidly upon exposure to surface conditions, leaving only confused accounts that are dismissed as mineralogical curiosities." "What makes this property different," Caldwell added, "is the unusually direct connection between the surface cave system and the deeper chambers where the primary formations exist. Most of these anomalies dwell at depths rarely reached by human exploration. Here, because of the peculiar geological conditions and my grandfather's ill-advised excavations, the barriers are thinner." The next several days were spent in intensive preparation. Additional workers were needed, but Caldwell was extremely selective in who could be brought into their confidence. Eventually, 4 men from the nearby community of Gilbert were hired, all experienced miners who had worked the lead deposits in the eastern Ozarks and who, crucially, had no family connections in the immediate area. These men, Abram Hargrave, Percy Donovan, Solomon Walsh, and Morris Levant, were told only that they would be helping to repair a collapsed section of specialized storage cellars beneath the Caldwell property. The pay offered was substantial, enough to guarantee their discretion, if not their full commitment, to the unclear task ahead. Equipment was brought in from Springfield, transported by wagon over the still snow-covered roads. This included electric lamps powered by portable batteries, a technology still rare in the rural Ozarks of 1903, reinforced timber for shoring up passageways, and several crates of specialized measuring instruments for monitoring unusual geological activity, as Webb put it. Throughout these preparations, Blackwood noted increasing tension between Caldwell and Webb. The doctor appeared to favor a more drastic approach, arguing repeatedly for what he called a complete sealing protocol, which Caldwell rejected as too dangerous and potentially ineffective. "My grandfather tried that in '56, Caldwell said during one heated exchange. "It only accelerated the process and made the formations more active when they reestablished themselves. Containment and monitoring is the only viable strategy." "Containment has failed," Webb countered. "How many more breaches will it take before you accept that more permanent measures are required?" The nature of these permanent measures was never clarified in Blackwood's presence, but the argument ended with Caldwell asserting his authority as the property owner and guardian of his family's legacy. Webb acquiesced, but his expression suggested that the disagreement was far from resolved. During this period, Blackwood had his first opportunity to speak privately with the miners who had been brought in to assist. Most were reticent, focused solely on the promised payment, but Solomon Walsh proved more talkative. A man in his 40s with decades of experience in the lead mines around Joplin, Walsh expressed unease about the unusual precautions being taken for what was supposedly a simple repair job. "Been down more holes in the ground than I can count," Walsh told Blackwood as they unloaded equipment from a wagon. "Never seen anyone bring this kind of gear for cellar work. And those special lamps the doctor keeps fussing over, those are the kind they use in mines with dangerous gas pockets. What kind of cellar needs protection against mine gas?" Blackwood, bound by his promise to Caldwell, offered no direct explanation, but Walsh seemed to sense his discomfort. "Listen," the miner said, lowering his voice, "I've heard stories about this property. Old-timers in Gilbert talk about strange sounds coming from the ground here, going back decades. Some say the Caldwell land is cursed. I didn't put much stock in such tales, but now I'm not so sure. Just tell me straight. Are we likely to come back up once we go down?" Unable to provide honest reassurance, Blackwood had changed the subject, but Walsh's question lingered in his thoughts. Were they undertaking something far more dangerous than even Caldwell and Webb had admitted? On November 18th, 6 days after the initial discovery of the breach, the work began in earnest. The opening in the western field had been carefully covered with a temporary structure to prevent snow from entering and to hide the activity from any curious neighbors. Blackwood, along with the 4 miners and under the supervision of both Caldwell and Webb, began the process of exploring the exposed passageway. What they found exceeded even the elaborate descriptions Caldwell had provided. The stone-lined tunnel extended nearly vertical for about 20 feet, before opening into a larger chamber that showed clear signs of both natural formation and human modification. Ancient-looking timber supports had partially rotted away, and the remains of iron brackets and hinges suggested that some kind of door or barrier had once been installed at this junction. Most disturbing were the markings on the walls, not the geological features one might expect in a natural cave, but deliberate inscriptions. Some resembled surveyor's marks, presumably made by Josiah Caldwell during his original exploration. Others were far more troubling, clusters of parallel lines that seemed to have been carved with a sharp implement, arranged in patterns too regular to be random, but too alien to be any known form of writing. And there was something else, a detail that Blackwood mentioned almost as an aside in his journal, but which takes on particular significance in light of later events. In the dust and debris on the chamber floor, they found tracks, or perhaps more accurately, impressions that corresponded to no animal known to exist in the Ozarks. They were roughly triangular in shape, with what appeared to be 3 distinct points of pressure, suggesting a tripod-like structure. More troubling still, these impressions led deeper into the tunnel system, away from the surface breach. As the men explored the chamber, using the electric lamps to illuminate its furthest recesses, Walsh made a discovery that caused even Webb to fall silent with apparent dread. In a narrow fissure at the back of the chamber, partially concealed by fallen debris, was what appeared to be a nest-like structure composed of an unusual crystalline material. The structure contained several spherical objects approximately the size of hen's eggs, but with a translucent mineral exterior through which dark shapes could be dimly perceived. "Don't touch those," Webb said sharply, as Walsh reached toward one of the objects. "They're growth nodules, and they're active. The heat from the depths is keeping them in stasis despite the cold air from the surface. Walsh withdrew his hand as if burned. "What kind of mineral forms like that?" he demanded. "The kind we're here to contain," Webb replied grimly. "And the fact that they're forming this close to the surface suggests the situation is even more precarious than we feared." The work of reinforcing the chamber took the remainder of that day, with the miners installing new timber supports and clearing debris from what appeared to be an original monitoring mechanism built into the rock itself. Webb spent hours examining this mechanism, consulting frequently with one of the leather-bound books that contained, according to Caldwell, his grandfather's technical specifications for the containment systems. Throughout this process, all of the men reported experiencing a growing sense of unease. The air in the chamber, though not stale, had a peculiar quality that Blackwood described as heavy with a scent I cannot name, like metal and old meat and something else entirely. Several times work had to be paused as the electric lamps flickered inexplicably, and all of them, even the experienced miners, admitted to hearing sounds that seemed to come from the deeper tunnels, scraping noises, the click of something against stone, and occasionally a sound like distant labored breathing. Most disturbing was an incident that occurred late in the afternoon, as Webb was attempting to align a series of metal components within the ancient monitoring mechanism. All of the electric lamps simultaneously dimmed, then brightened to an intensity that threatened to burn out their filaments before returning to normal illumination. In that moment of extreme brightness, Blackwood and at least two of the miners reported seeing a shadow move across the far wall of the chamber, a shadow that belonged to none of them, and which appeared to have too many parts, moving too quickly, as miner Percy Donovan described it. Webb dismissed their concerns, attributing the shadow to a quirk of the fluctuating light, but his hands shook visibly as he returned to his work on the mechanism. By nightfall, Webb had determined that the original monitoring mechanism could be repaired, but would require specialized parts that would have to be fabricated in Springfield. This meant a delay of at least 3 days, during which the breach would have to be secured as best they could with temporary measures. It was decided that a rotating watch would be established, with 2 men stationed at the entrance at all times, to ensure that nothing emerged from below. The miners, the Aistis, who by now had begun to realize that they were involved in something far beyond a simple repair job, demanded additional compensation for this unexpected duty. Caldwell agreed without hesitation, his concern clearly focused on maintaining security rather than managing costs. As the group made their way back to the farmhouse for the night, Blackwood noticed something that he recorded in his journal with evident unease. The snow for a good 20 feet around the entrance had melted completely away, though the temperature hasn't risen above freezing all day. And the grass beneath, grass that should have been winter dormant and brown, had a strange, sickly green tinge to it, as if it were growing, but not rightly. Some of the blades seemed to be bending toward the entrance, like plants reaching for light, except they were pointing into darkness. The next 48 hours passed in tense anticipation. The temporary watch was maintained, with Blackwood taking several shifts alongside the miners. Nothing emerged from the tunnel, but all reported the same unsettling sounds growing more frequent, and, it seemed, closer to their position at the entrance. Caldwell, whose health appeared to be deteriorating rapidly under the stress of the situation, spent most of his time in his study, reviewing the old journals and maps inherited from his grandfather. During one of Blackwood's brief returns to the farmhouse to warm himself and eat a meal, he overheard a disturbing fragment of conversation between Caldwell and Webb. The signs matched the progression described in the 1856 emergence, Caldwell was saying, his voice weak but urgent. The temperature increase, the accelerated growth of surface vegetation, the magnetic disturbances affecting the equipment. The phenomenon is intensifying. "We don't have time to fabricate replacement parts for the original mechanism," Webb responded. "The complete sealing protocol is our only option now. We need to set the charges deeper at the junction points your grandfather mapped. It's the only way to collapse enough of the system to seal it permanently. And if it accelerates the process instead, through pathways we don't yet know about," Caldwell asked. "The last sealing attempt altered the groundwater throughout the entire county before the containment was reestablished. Can you accept that responsibility?" Webb's answer was lost as Blackwood moved away, not wanting to be discovered eavesdropping, but the implications of what he had heard were clear. Whatever geological anomaly existed beneath the Caldwell property represented a phenomenon far more unusual than he had initially understood, and the measures being considered to address it carried their own significant risks. On the morning of November 20th, Webb departed for Springfield to arrange for the fabrication of the necessary parts. He estimated he would return by the evening of the 22nd, and he left Caldwell with strict instructions to maintain the watch and to use dynamite to collapse the entrance temporarily if any direct evidence of imminent emergence was observed. It was during Webb's absence that the situation began to deteriorate rapidly. The first indication that something had changed came during the evening watch on the 21st, when Blackwood and the miner Solomon Walsh were stationed at the entrance. Shortly after midnight, the electric lamp they were using failed completely, plunging them into darkness. As Walsh fumbled to light a backup kerosene lantern, both men heard a distinct series of clicks from the chamber below, followed by what Blackwood described as a sound like many small objects being dragged across stone, coming rapidly nearer. Walsh managed to light the lantern just as something began to emerge from the vertical shaft that led to the chamber. In his journal, Blackwood's description of what he saw becomes fragmented and in places almost incoherent, suggesting the profound impact of the experience on his psyche. He mentions structures that moved wrong and too many facets catching the light, but provides no cohesive description that would allow a clear visualization of whatever began to emerge from the darkness below. What is clear is that both men reacted with instinctive alarm. Walsh threw the lantern directly at the emerging formation, while Blackwood ran to alert Caldwell and the other miners. By the time they returned, armed with additional lamps, whatever had begun to emerge had retreated back into the chamber. The only evidence of its presence was a strange, viscous substance on the rim of the shaft, which Blackwood described as like oil, but thicker and with a phosphorescent quality that made it glow faintly in the darkness. Donovan, who had some background in chemistry from his work in the more sophisticated mining operations near Joplin, examined the substance cautiously. "It's not like any mine seepage I've ever seen," he reported. "It's not petroleum or water with mineral content. It feels almost organic, and it's warm to the touch, warmer than it should be in this cold." Levant, the oldest and most experienced of the miners, refused to even approach the entrance after seeing the substance. "I've been in mines where men left because they ignored the warnings," he said. "Unexplained fluids, strange sounds, equipment failing, these are signs that any miner with sense pays attention to. Whatever you gentlemen are dealing with here, it's not a collapsed cellar, and I'm leaving this property immediately." Caldwell, confronted with the possible desertion of the miners, made a decision that would prove fateful. He invited all of them to return to the farmhouse where, over glasses of his strongest whiskey, he revealed the complete history of the property and the nature of what they were containing. His account, as relayed in Blackwood's journal, was similar to what he had shared previously, but included additional details about the physical characteristics of the anomaly and its apparent ability to influence its environment in ways that defied conventional understanding. "It can alter the temperature around it," Caldwell explained, according to Blackwood's recollection. "It can affect electrical currents and possibly magnetic fields. Most concerning of all, it appears to propagate over considerable distances through means we don't understand, possibly mineral veins, possibly something else entirely. When one formation becomes active, others respond, even when separated by significant distances. The miners listened in stunned silence. When Caldwell finished, Levant was the first to speak. "I have heard old stories," he said slowly. "Tales the Cherokee told about parts of these mountains, places they wouldn't go because of what they called the old ones beneath. Most dismissed it as superstition, but the Cherokee knew these hills better than anyone." Hargrave, who had been quiet throughout most of the preceding days, added his own observation. "Last year, near the Baxter Springs mines, 3 men left a newly opened shaft. The company said it was unsafe, but there was no evidence of that. A friend who was part of the survey team told me they found marks on the rock like nothing he'd ever seen before, and an oily residue that sounds a lot like what we saw tonight." With the full context of their situation now understood, the miners engaged in a heated debate about how to proceed. Donovan and Levant argued for leaving immediately regardless of the pay. Walsh and Hargrave, however, advocated for staying to help implement what Caldwell called emergency containment measures. "If what you're saying is true," Walsh reasoned, "then this phenomenon could spread beyond this property if it's not contained. I've got family in Gilbert. I can't just walk away knowing they might be at risk." Caldwell, upon seeing the substance at the entrance, made an immediate decision to implement what he called emergency containment measures. The miners were instructed to set charges of dynamite at strategic points around the entrance shaft, with the goal of collapsing it in a controlled manner that would block access from below without causing wider structural damage that might create new breaches. This work was carried out with frantic haste, all of them aware of the sounds from below, growing increasingly agitated. By dawn on November 22nd, the charges were in place. The miners, Walsh and Blackwood, withdrew to what Caldwell deemed a safe distance, while Caldwell himself remained to light the fuse. What happened next is known only through the fragmented accounts that emerged later, as Blackwood's journal entries for the next several days are missing, torn from the book by someone unknown. The official report filed with the Searcy County Sheriff stated only that there was an accidental explosion on the Caldwell property that resulted in a significant geological event and caused minor injuries to several workers. However, newspaper accounts from the following week suggest a more complex scenario. The Marshall Republican reported that the explosion was heard up to 5 miles away, and that unusual lights were seen in the sky above the Caldwell property immediately afterward. More telling is an article from the Springfield Leader, which noted that Dr. Montgomery Webb arrived at the scene shortly after the explosion, accompanied by what were described as specialists from St. Louis, and that the property was immediately quarantined due to unspecified environmental concerns. A single sheet of paper, apparently torn from Blackwood's journal and discovered separately among his possessions years later, contains a hurried, almost illegible account of the moments immediately following the explosion. The handwriting, normally neat and methodical, is erratic and in places smudged with what appears to be a dark substance. "The charges went off, but something was wrong," Blackwood wrote. "The ground shook too much, like something beneath was pushing back against the force of the explosion. Caldwell was thrown backward by the blast, landed hard. We ran to help him, but before we reached him, the ground began to move, not like an earthquake, more deliberate. The earth around the entrance shaft bulged upward, as if something massive was pushing from below. Then it split open, not just at the original breach, but in a circle around it, maybe 30 feet across. The account continues, growing more disjointed. They emerged everywhere, not just one or two like before, but dozens of crystalline formations, different sizes, some small like the specimen in the jar, others much larger. They moved across the ground with surprising speed. Walsh moved forward to examine one, and it seemed to react to his presence, extending projections toward him. He backed away quickly. Levant and Hargrave left immediately. Caldwell was still down, trying to crawl away. One of the formations approached him rapidly, extending multiple crystalline appendages. He called for help, but the account breaks off abruptly at this point, the remainder of the page torn away. What is known with certainty is that Jeremiah Caldwell disappeared during the explosion or its immediate aftermath, though the exact circumstances remained unclear. The 4 miners left the area immediately afterward, and despite later attempts by authorities to locate them for statements, none were ever found. The property was indeed quarantined, with guards posted at its boundaries for nearly a month, ostensibly due to concerns about geological instability and potential contamination. Blackwood's account resumes on December 18th, nearly a month after the explosion. By this time, he was no longer at the Caldwell property, but was instead staying at a boarding house in Springfield, under what appears to have been Dr. Webb's supervision or perhaps protection. His journal entries from this period are markedly different from his earlier writings, less coherent, filled with tangents and obsessive returns to certain details, suggesting a mind under significant strain. What can be pieced together suggests that the explosion did not go as planned. Rather than simply collapsing the entrance, it seems to have triggered a more extensive structural failure that opened multiple new breaches. Worse still, it apparently provoked a swift and aggressive propagation of whatever geological anomaly dwelled in the deeper chambers of the cave system. Blackwood's fragmented recollections describe they emerged everywhere and the ground moving like it was alive beneath our feet. He mentions Caldwell being surrounded, but provides no clear details of what exactly happened to his employer. The miners apparently fled immediately, while Blackwood himself was recovered by the doctor, who arrived just as the situation was reaching its most critical point. Webb and his colleagues from St. Louis, who are never named but are described as men who knew what to do, who had the right equipment, implemented what Blackwood refers to as the final protocol. Only this apparently involved the use of some form of chemical agent introduced into the cave system through the various breaches, followed by more controlled explosions to seal the entrances permanently. In a letter dated January 3, 1904, discovered among Webb's papers after his death, the doctor provided a more clinical description of these measures to a colleague at Johns Hopkins. The copper sulfate compound proved effective against the smaller formations, but the larger specimens showed significant resistance. We were forced to employ the experimental phosphorus-based neutralizing agent, which, while ultimately successful in halting their propagation, produced unexpected side effects in the surrounding soil and groundwater. Long-term monitoring will be essential. The quarantine period was apparently to ensure that this final protocol had been effective and that the anomaly had not spread into the surrounding countryside. Blackwood mentions teams testing the soil and analyzing the water in all the springs for miles around. The fact that the quarantine was lifted after a month suggests that these measures were deemed successful, at least in the short term. Blackwood himself appears to have been deeply affected by whatever he witnessed in those final moments at the entrance breach. His journal entries from December 1903 through March 1904 are filled with descriptions of nightmares in which he is pursued through endless stone corridors by crystalline structures he can hear but never quite see. He mentions persistent physical symptoms as well, trembling in his hands, unexplained fevers, and, most disturbingly, a strange pattern of small, hard nodules developing under the skin of his left arm, which he compulsively measures and records, noting with increasing alarm their gradual spread toward his shoulder. Webb arranged for Blackwood to be examined by several specialists, but none could provide a diagnosis for his condition. In late March 1904, Webb made arrangements for Blackwood to travel to a private sanatorium in Colorado, where the mountain air was thought to be beneficial for various respiratory and nervous conditions. This marked the end of Blackwood's direct involvement with the events at the Caldwell property, though his journal indicates that Webb maintained contact through correspondence for several years afterward. The long-term effectiveness of the final protocol measures, however, remains a matter of some debate among those few who are aware of the full story. Webb himself maintained a careful watch over the property for the remainder of his life, purchasing it from Caldwell's estate and leaving strict provisions in his will for its continued monitoring. These provisions are apparently still in effect today, with the land remaining private and unoccupied, managed by a trust with connections to certain research departments at Washington University in St. Louis. Intriguingly, Webb's personal correspondence from the years following the Caldwell incident suggests that he did not believe the threat had been permanently eliminated. In a letter to a colleague dated 1912, he wrote, "The containment has held for nearly a decade now, but I am under no illusion that it is permanent. The phenomenon operates on a geological time scale vastly different from our own. It may remain dormant for years, decades, even centuries before becoming active again. What concerns me most is that each emergence event seems to yield variants that are more adapted to surface conditions than their predecessors. Evolution continues in the depths, and it is proceeding in a direction that bodes ill for any future interactions." Blackwood never returned to farming or to the Ozarks. After several months in the Colorado sanatorium, his physical symptoms gradually subsided, though his journal suggests that the psychological impact of his experiences never fully faded. He eventually settled in Denver, where he found work as a night watchman, a profession that, he noted wryly in one entry, suits a man who has learned to listen for sounds in the darkness. His journal, which came to light only because it was found among his possessions by distant relatives settling his estate after his death in 1952, provides our most direct window into the events at the Caldwell farm, limited though it may be. But there are other sources that hint at a larger, more disturbing context for those events. In 1968, during renovations to the Searcy County Courthouse, workers discovered a sealed metal box hidden within a wall cavity. Inside were documents dating back to the 1850s, including correspondence between Josiah Caldwell and various scientific institutions, and more ominously, official reports of similar anomalous geological phenomena at locations scattered throughout the Ozarks, spanning a period from 1856 to 1938. These reports suggest that what occurred at the Caldwell farm was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that some researchers believe continues to this day. There are accounts, difficult to verify but persistent, of unusual mineral formations in remote areas of the Ozarks, of strange sounds heard near certain cave entrances, and of peculiar markings found carved into trees and rocks in the deepest parts of the forests. One particularly notable case occurred in 1978 when a group of spelunkers exploring a previously unmapped cave system near the Buffalo River reported finding a chamber filled with crystalline structures that seemed to react to their presence, moving subtly when illuminated by their lights. The spelunkers quickly left the cave, and when they returned the next day with photographic equipment, they found that the entrance had collapsed overnight. The geological survey that investigated the collapse determined it to be natural, but the team's report contains a curious addendum, noting that the soil around the former entrance contained chemical compounds inconsistent with local geology. Most intriguing of all are the records of soil and water testing conducted by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources in the vicinity of the former Caldwell property in the early 1990s. These tests, ostensibly part of a routine environmental survey, revealed trace amounts of chemical compounds that defied easy identification, compounds that one researcher described in an internal memo as similar to those found at only one other location in North America. A deep mine shaft in northern Michigan that was abandoned under unusual circumstances in 1979. The memo goes on to note that these compounds appear to have unusual effects on local flora and fauna, producing accelerated growth rates in certain plant species and what are described as anomalous morphological variations in several insect populations found in the immediate vicinity. Most concerning was the observation that these effects seem to be expanding outward from the original site at a slow but measurable rate, suggesting that whatever had been introduced to contain the emergence in 1903 was gradually breaking down or being neutralized by natural processes. What are we to make of all this? The rational mind resists explanations that venture too far from established understanding. Perhaps what Josiah Caldwell discovered was simply a previously unknown geological process, misinterpreted through the lens of 19th century knowledge and subsequently exaggerated through decades of retelling. Perhaps the containment protocols were merely pragmatic measures to deal with dangerous cave-ins or pockets of toxic gas. Yet certain details resist such mundane explanations. The preserved specimen mentioned in Blackwood's journal, which was apparently transferred to Webb's collection in Springfield and later donated to a private museum in Chicago, was examined by geologists in the 1960s who found its crystalline structure fundamentally different from any known mineral formation on Earth. This specimen was subsequently lost, or perhaps deliberately removed from public accessibility during a museum reorganization in 1972. Similarly difficult to explain are the photographs found among Webb's possessions after his death in 1931, showing what appeared to be structured formations deep within the cave system that bear no resemblance to known geological processes. These formations suggest organization and purpose, with symmetrical arrangements of crystalline pillars and archways that several architects have noted would be remarkably efficient at supporting the immense weight of the overlying rock. Perhaps most compelling is a fragment of audio recording discovered in the archives of Washington University in 2001, labeled simply Field Recording Robriel 17, Caldwell Site 1927. The recording, made on primitive equipment and heavily degraded, captures what seems to be the sound of Webb's voice briefly describing the setting. Approximately 300 feet below surface level, Western Tunnel Junction, followed by several minutes of what audio technicians have described as non-random acoustic patterns that do not correspond to any known natural cave sounds or geological activity. Analyses have suggested that these patterns contain structures similar to those found in certain forms of crystalline resonance, with repeating elements arranged in sequences that suggest some form of natural organization rather than random noise. In the end, what happened beneath the Caldwell farm in those cold November days of 1903 remains a mystery preserved in fragmented accounts and hints of a reality that exists just beyond the edges of conventional understanding. The caves of the Ozarks, thousands of them mapped, but perhaps as many still undiscovered, continue to hold their secrets. For those who might be tempted to explore these secrets firsthand, a word of caution is in order. The former Caldwell property remains private land, carefully monitored and legally inaccessible. More importantly, if the accounts discussed here have any basis in fact, there may be geological phenomena dwelling in the darkest recesses of certain cave systems that are best left undisturbed, formations that have existed in isolation for unimaginable spans of time, developing along patterns vastly different from those familiar to surface geology. As Dr. Webb wrote in his final journal entry, discovered among his papers after his death, some boundaries were established by nature for profound reasons, and some separations should remain permanent. What dwells in the deepest dark has adapted to conditions we can barely comprehend, and in that adaptation has become something that cannot, must not, interact with our world. The protocols must be maintained, the seals checked and reinforced, for as long as human civilization endures. For if they fail completely, what emerges will not retreat again. The Caldwell farm itself has long since disappeared, the buildings fallen to ruin and reclaimed by the forest. Only a few scattered foundation stones remain visible among the underbrush, unnoticed by the occasional hikers who pass nearby on their way to more popular destinations in the Buffalo National River area. The land gives no obvious sign of the events that transpired there, nor of what may still exist far beneath its surface. Yet locals still avoid the area, especially after dark. They speak of unusual sounds carried on the wind on certain still nights, sounds like distant clicking and scraping, as of something hard moving against stone. They mention livestock that become agitated for no apparent reason, dogs that refuse to enter certain sections of the forest, and unexplained lights sometimes seen hovering over specific sinkholes after heavy rains have saturated the ground. These may be merely the embellishments of folklore, the way that rural communities often weave tales around locations with troubled histories. Or they may be indications that the final protocol, implemented by Webb and his colleagues, was not, in fact, final, that something still dwells in the dark spaces beneath the Ozarks, separated from our world by barriers that grow thinner with each passing year. In 2012, a geology graduate student from the University of Arkansas conducted a series of ground-penetrating radar surveys in the general vicinity of the former Caldwell property as part of a study on karst formations in the region. The student's equipment malfunctioned repeatedly during the survey, producing what were initially dismissed as erroneous readings. When properly analyzed, however, these readings revealed what appeared to be an extensive network of cavities and tunnels far deeper than typical cave formations in the area, extending down to depths of at least 600 feet below the surface. Most interesting was the student's observation, recorded in field notes but omitted from the final published paper at the insistence of a thesis advisor, that certain sections of this deep network appeared to change configuration between successive scans conducted just days apart, as if portions of the cave system were somehow being actively modified or were naturally mobile in ways that defied conventional understanding of geological processes. The student abandoned this line of research shortly thereafter, accepting a position with a private environmental consulting firm in another state. When contacted by individuals interested in the unpublished findings, the former student declined to discuss the matter, citing a non-disclosure agreement signed as a condition of receiving certain research grants. As you drive the winding roads that cross the ridges and valleys of the Ozarks, passing farms that have stood for generations and forests that conceal countless sinkholes and cave entrances, consider this: the ground beneath your feet may not be as solid as it appears. There are spaces down there, vast networks of them, that have never known sunlight. And in some of those spaces, if the accounts from the Caldwell farm are to be believed, there are phenomena that wait and grow, perhaps even now responding to the vibrations of our movement far above. The protocols established by Webb have been maintained for over a century now, the responsibility passing to new guardians as the old ones departed. But nothing lasts forever, not stone, not iron, not even the most carefully constructed barriers. And those who monitor such things report, in carefully worded internal documents, that the frequency of anomalous readings from certain sites in the Ozarks has increased steadily over the past decade. What this means for the future, only time will tell. But perhaps the next time you feel an unexplained chill while walking in a remote section of these ancient mountains, or hear a sound that doesn't quite match any known natural process, you might consider that you are not experiencing merely the natural ambiance of the wilderness. You might, without knowing it, be receiving a message from something that dwells far below, a message that translates, in its way, to a simple but terrifying truth. It is still there, it is still growing, and somewhere a barrier that has held for generations is beginning to fail.